Audrey McDonald is a registered holistic nutritionist who specializes in cancer nutrition, arthritis conditions, and other inflammatory conditions such as diabetes. Audrey also teaches at the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition and gives talks in retirement homes to seniors. She lives in Toronto with her husband, who is a chef, and her beloved dogs and parrots, who are also fed a wholesome diet. Audrey, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for today's webinar. You did a great job with your chapter contribution, controlling inflammation with nutrition, and I'd like to expand on it by asking you some questions.
Wonderful. Let's get started.
Sounds fantastic. Hey, Audrey, why did you decide to become a nutritionist, and what made you decide to specialize in inflammatory conditions, specifically cancer?
That's a good question, George. A lot of people come to nutrition for a variety of reasons, but the majority tend to be because someone has had some type of health condition in the past that they haven't exactly been able to resolve via the normal medical channels. And I'm like no one else. I've had the same type of issues as many people. So when I was about 39, I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. And I thought, having been raised on a typical French diet where we consume tons of cheese and we ate very well at home, that I would be one of the last people to have osteoporosis. And I went to see the specialist, and for the first 2 or 3 years, I continued to actually lose bone mass. And I thought, by the time I'm 50, I'm not going to have any bones left. So I decided it was time that instead of relying solely on my physician, that I also took an active role in my healthcare. So I started doing a lot of research. And the majority of that research kept pointing me towards nutrition. Well, I should say actually nutrition and exercise. But nutrition was the component that really fascinated me the most. I had always been athletic. I'd been a runner since I was, 14 or 15. And I was still running at the time as well. I was very athletic in school and participated in sports. So for me, the key component was nutrition. And the more that I studied, the more that I actually realized how important nutrition was and how much we don't actually understand about nutrition and specifically digestion. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about digestion, I mean our ability not only to eat the right foods, but to actually break down those foods and be able to absorb the nutrients that we need so that our body can utilize them and remain strong.
I see. And this is actually a two-part question. And I appreciate you sharing your history, because it seems like a lot of the contributors to our project have experienced their own health challenges, which basically led them on this path. So basically, like the next couple of questions here. So what are inflammatory conditions, and how does digestion play a role in inflammation?
Okay, so when we talk about inflammatory conditions, we're talking really about conditions such as heart disease, cancer, diabetes, stroke, which is a form of heart disease, of course, Alzheimer's, kidney disease, chronic lower respiratory disease. All of these are types of inflammatory diseases. Allergies are also very much of an inflammatory type of disease. Now, when we talk about inflammation, we're really talking about everyone's familiar with inflammation in terms of, oh, I fell and I twisted my ankle and now it's swollen. But we also have a lot of internal inflammation, things that we don't see externally, which are what are very problematic to our health overall.
I see. And what are some of the factors that affect digestion as we age?
There are actually a lot of factors, and it all goes around, once again, the inflammation. So I'd like to expand a little bit more on inflammation. We're really talking about chronic inflammation. The acute inflammation is the inflammation that we experience when we twist our ankle and we have immediate swelling. That's the inflammation we see externally. Our chronic inflammation, though, is what's associated with aging. It's associated with obesity. A lot of us are going to associate it with a diet high in saturated fat and high in sugar content, for example. Chronic inflammation, however, is different from acute inflammation because it stays with us. It stays internally. We don't see it, so we don't necessarily know or realize that we're suffering from chronic inflammation until we actually are diagnosed with some of the conditions and the diseases that I mentioned earlier. So our common risk factors for inflammation are going to be age, obesity, diet, low sex hormones, believe it or not, smoking, and a variety of sleep disorders, but the majority being, or the bottom line really being, lack of sleep.
I see. And you did say like your food choices influence inflammation in the body, and you touched on saturated fats and sugars. Are there any other foods that should be avoided?
Oh, there are lots of foods that should be avoided when you're suffering from inflammation. And as an example, if you have any of those disease conditions that I mentioned, then the types of foods that you want to avoid are what we call nightshade foods. These are foods that will cause internal inflammation. So it's going to be foods such as eggplant, peppers, potatoes, tomatoes. Tobacco is a nightshade plant, so smokers commonly have a great deal of internal inflammation.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, and things that we think are really good for us, such as goji berries. We know them as antioxidants, but they're also nightshades, so they can be inflammatory as well. So if you have an inflammatory condition, you want to avoid those. I'll go through in a little while the whole digestive process so we understand how that contributes to inflammation. But foods that we commonly eat on a regular basis that we may eat in excess. So oranges and bananas. A lot of people eat oranges or drink orange juice daily. Bananas are a popular fruit as well. So things that we eat on a regular basis, meaning we don't rotate the foods that we're eating daily, these things can become inflammatory as well. Other inflammatory foods are going to be shellfish, your large fish such as tuna, for example, due to the high toxic levels of mercury and other toxins in them. Conventional or processed meats. The conventional meats, because you have a lot of antibiotics and you have a lot of pesticides that are in their food chain. You also have some growth hormones depending on where the meat is coming from. We do get a lot of meat from south of our border, of course. Processed meat, because there are a lot of chemicals such as nitrates in the processed meats that are very difficult on our digestive system as well. And unfortunately, foods that we love, such as the cheese, I mentioned that earlier, ice cream, cream, milk, and a lot of people, as most are aware these days, have gluten intolerances as well. So those gluten intolerances can really cause a lot of sensitivities in our digestive system too.
I see. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, that stress and sleep play a role in our health. I wonder if you can expand on that a little bit.
Stress and sleep are a huge factor. And I think going forward in the next, say the next 10, 15 years, we're going to be studying a lot more and seeing a lot more research about stress and the lack of sleep. It's a large picture that we kind of need to look at. I'll go into a little bit of physiological explanation in terms of how stress affects the body physiologically. So when you start looking at stress, and stress can be psychological, it can be physical, such as environmental stresses that are coming from pollutants, environmental toxins, etc. And of course, it can be just the day-to-day stress that we get dealing with either our financial, family, or work-related situations. We have two tiny little glands that sit on top of our kidneys. And for the size of those glands, they can really affect our health a great deal. Yeah. These are called our adrenal glands. And what happens is our adrenal glands, whenever we're stressed, they release a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol is, in essence, a hormone that when we used to be cave people, for example, and we were being chased by lions, tigers, and bears, we would release cortisol so that glucose, which is the main form of energy our body accepts and utilizes, that glucose would be released so that our muscles would have a lot of energy so that we could run for our lives.
Mm-hmm.
The problem today is, even though we are not being chased by lions, tigers, and bears, or at least I hope we're not being chased by lions, tigers, and bears, the biggest stress on us still elicits the same type of reaction from our adrenal glands.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of think of getting up in the morning, let's just take the average mother. Gets up in the morning, she has to get the children off to school, she has to make the school lunches, she needs to get herself ready for work, she needs to possibly make lunch or make breakfast for her partner. At any rate, you get the idea, it's a very stressful time.
That's right.
And subsequently, she has to then get on maybe the 401 and sit in traffic, stress about getting to work on time, and then her day actually starts all anew. Most of us today have stressful positions at work. I'm not saying it's stress, from the, first hour that you enter to the last hour that you exit, but a lot of times there is a great deal of stress throughout the day. Then, of course, you have to get back on the highways. Then you have to get home, take care of fixing dinner for the kids, helping them with homework. All of these activities end up being one stressor piled upon another stressor and another stressor, and we constantly have these bouts of cortisol which are being released.
Yes.
So we have cortisol, which normally under regular circumstances is anti-inflammatory, such as if you twist your ankle, cortisol is going to have an anti-inflammatory response. But when you're constantly emitting this cortisol, releasing cortisol in response to the stressors during your day, then you start to see some exhaustion come in.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just the cortisol, however, that gets released. What ends up happening is when cortisol is released, that's sending a message to your stored glucose. So whether it's the stores in your liver or the stores in your muscle tissues, for example, it's saying release glucose so we can run and save our skin.
Yes.